fascinating example recently where the carbon dating got it wrong. In around the late 800s AD, around 870 something or other, there was a group of Scandinavian Vikings had come into Derbyshire in England. And that's a matter of the historical record. People observed it and they wrote it down, so we know that's when it happened. Now, a mass grave was found that had something like 250 to 300 different individuals in this grave. People did some carbon dating on the bones and discovered that the bones actually dated back a couple of centuries earlier, like around 600 AD. There was an historical record of them being there in the 800s. So this great debate ensued. Were the scientists right? Were the historians right?
Carbon dating, the darling of the evolutionist. But is it always reliable? Let's check it out.
Now, there's a fascinating example recently where the carbon dating got it wrong. And it was really interesting. There was in around the late 800s AD, around 870 something or other, there was a group of Scandinavian Vikings had come into Derbyshire in England, and they'd wintered there. And that's a matter of the historical record. People observed it and they wrote it down, so we know that's when it happened. Now, a mass grave was found that had something like 250 to 300 different individuals in this grave. And people did some carbon dating on the bones and discovered that the bones actually dated back a couple of centuries earlier, like around 600 AD. So they were pretty sure these were the Vikings, but something was wrong because there's no historical record of the Vikings being in Derbyshire in 600.
So the debate was, you had the historical record written down by historians throughout the years of the time period where the Vikings were in this area. But some scientists had carbon dated the bones of these people in this grave, these alleged Vikings, and they came up with a period that was 200 years different. So how did we figure out who's right, who's wrong?
There was an historical record of them being there in the 800s. So this great debate ensued. Were the scientists right? Were the historians right? And the scientists said, no, carbon dating is a wonderful method. It gives accurate results. So they stood their ground, and the historians say, but there's no record of Vikings there in the 600s, but they were there in the late 800s. And then somebody woke up to what the solution was. Turns out the Vikings have a largely seafood diet. Interestingly, fish, shellfish and finfish have less carbon-14 in them than land-dwelling animals and plants do, simply because of the rate of absorption of carbon into the oceans and various marine effects. So the diet that these Vikings had was actually deficient, if you like, in carbon-14, which made their bones look a couple of hundred years older than they really were.
So their diet affected the carbon-14 date reading.
That's right. So we get
He said the diet and other naturally occurring phenomena or naturally occurring events that impacted the dating. So now make sure you pay attention here, because he gets into the issue when it comes to assumptions that are made in reference to the dating, and how the dating, the quote unquote scientific method, when it comes to historical events, not talking about science measuring current testable, observable events, but historical events. And he's going to get into some really interesting detail on that topic. Check it out.
a carbon-14 date a couple hundred years earlier than the historical date. But there's a very important lesson that emerges out of this, and that is that the authority always goes to the historical record, not to science. And if you think about it,
He'll explain why.
Science is about observing things in the present so we can understand how the universe works. But you cannot observe the past. So in a very real sense, dealing with historical events is actually outside of the competence of the scientist. He has to be able to do repeatable experiments, which are always done in the present. So when you're dealing with the past, the scientist has to make assumptions, like we know the C14 to C12 ratio when that particular specimen died. But maybe we don't, as in the case of the Vikings. So the historical record is always in authority over the scientific result of an experiment when we're dealing with the past.
Just to point out or remind y'all of what he was saying, the impact that the environment, their diet, and environmental events had on the dating. I've seen studies where they had rocks that were brand new, rocks that had came out of volcanoes and were freshly formed, were known to be less than 10 years old, that were dated to be thousands, tens of thousands of years old by carbon dating methods. What it does is just shows that there are other things that can impact when it comes to dating. And like he referenced, when we're talking about historical events, your best bet is to lean more favorably on the side of historians, historical events, historical documentation. Now that could be flawed as well. It's not perfect, but science is extremely weak when the further back you go. And many times when we're dealing with the age of the earth, we're dealing with when dinosaurs roamed the earth or various things like that. We're talking about things that cannot be tested, cannot be observed in the present, cannot be tests that cannot be repeated. You're testing, you're walking in with a ton of assumptions. You're assuming that everything that we're seeing, the events that impacted this bone or this rock were consistent throughout time. There were no catastrophic events like a global flood, for instance, or anything along those lines, any type of volcanic activity. We're making assumptions that everything that we see now in the present was exactly what these items experienced in the past. And that's where the problem lies.
Saying that when we try and date using carbon-14, we're making a lot of assumptions before we can calculate the age.
That's right. Even with all the efforts to try and limit those assumptions, they're still there, and something can come up that we have not thought about. So history is always the reference point, the historical record. Now, I believe that in the Bible, we have a written historical record of what God did right from the very beginning of creation, which is why the Bible's record of history is the authority, I believe, and we need to apply that to all of our scientific thinking when we're addressing things in the past.
Very good. Very, very good. Just a little food for thought. If you appreciate content like this, make sure you hit that like and subscribe button. And before you go, make sure you check out this video. It's very similar to what you just saw if you want to get into this topic a bit more, and I'll see you over there.